Welcome back, everybody, once again for episode 9 of the iProgress podcast. I'm your host, Dean, and as always, I'm joined by Craig. And today we're talking about something which is very timely, very poignant, and something which I've actually done a bit of writing on in the past, is the attainment gap. So for those of you who haven't heard of the attainment gap before, what the attainment gap encompasses is a comparison in terms of some key demographics, such as age, sex, ethnicity, in terms of how many first or 2-1 degrees, especially in the UK, people are getting relative to 2-2s or thirds. And we've seen this divide historically, both across institutions within the UK and further afield abroad. And Craig's got some more up-to-date statistics on this as well to share.
Yeah, so there was a survey that was done by Universities UK in 2019. What they did was they tried to identify the number of people, the proportions of different groups that would have what's referred to as a good degree. Now, what we know is that every degree is good because getting a degree is difficult to do. But in terms of how Universities UK categorise that, it means that people are getting a first or a upper second class, so a 2-1 degree. Now, what they found was that 81% of white students obtained such a degree. Now, those from a black ethnic background got those degrees at a rate of 58%, and those from Asian backgrounds got those good degrees at a rate of 71%. Now, obviously, these are huge issues in terms of disparities in outcome. And it's not necessarily the case that we're saying that there are differences in how these groups are treated, but there are disparities in the way that they achieve their degrees. Now, this isn't just an issue in terms of the degree outcome, but also the downstream effects of that in terms of employability, in terms of social mobility. And we have a real kind of interest in seeing how these things play out in kind of broader outcomes in terms of well-being as well. As there are certain things that that we can do maybe to boost some of these groups in terms of their attainment. It's not just racial groups though. If you look at different people from different socioeconomic backgrounds, those who were having or who were eligible for free school meals at school. So these are people who are at the lower ends of the socioeconomic distribution. They were twice as likely to drop out of their degree course than those who were not on free school meals at school. And again, so we've got a potential class issue here as well in terms of attainment and progression. So Dean, I know that you've written about this a lot previously, and was it this year or last year you had a paper in the Times Higher Education Supplement about attainment gaps, and you identified 3 different things that we could do. Should we go through each of those in turn and just kind of explore what your argument was?
Yeah, of course. So the first topic the first topic within that online article was about how we design the material as academics in conjunction with individuals who we perceive on our programs who aren't picking up as many of these good degrees as other groups. And this is really important because what it does in this article is say, okay, so us as academics, we have an important and pivotal role, regardless of how well our program is performing in terms of closing these awarding gaps. We have a role to best boost or help our students as much as we can. And that's not to say that everybody within that cohort or everyone within that demographic needs this assistance, but it's trying to level the playing field, which for us is pivotal. It's vital that we make sure that everybody has the necessary tools to succeed. And so in terms of how we design material, what I proposed was oftentimes when we are teaching material as academics, we might be very experienced, we might have solid expertise in that particular area. And as such, it might be quite easy for us to assume a certain degree of knowledge, or for us to assume that everybody knows how to action a request. Everybody knows how to access certain material, and in accessing that material, we also might assume that everybody is going to be having similar, even cognitive mechanisms in terms of how they understand it and how they apply it. But this might not be the case. It also might be some of the examples that we're presenting individuals. It might be that if we make cultural references, especially in the UK setting, I realized that a couple of years ago I made a reference to Rosie and Jim, which is a 10-12-year-old cartoon puppet animatronic show about two people on a barge. And not only does this kind of show my age, but it also kind of isolated a particular group of individuals who I was sharing this story to, because lots of other people within that classroom couldn't access and fully kind of understand that example. And if the examples that we're giving aren't accessible, what that means is that students are left trying to pick up the pieces, and it's almost if we're kind of assuming a certain degree of knowledge to them. And so the key point about this point is that we work with students to design some of the materials. Is it visually accessible? In terms of telling stories and examples, are those stories and examples relevant? Are they contemporary? Are they digestible by demographics within our teaching cohort?
Yeah, I mean, there's a couple of things I guess to pick up on. The first one is Rosie and Jim. I'm sure that's more than 10 or 15 years ago, mate. You're probably thinking 20, 25 years. So yeah, you definitely need to update your examples in sessions, I think. More seriously though, I think with this particular point, I spoke to you at the time when you were writing this, and I think I had a slight issue with this particular point, and I think you've kind of alleviated some of those issues. So I know that the kind of co-production of material is big in terms of things like decolonizing the curriculum, and I've been into a few things. Maybe that's a topic for another day, but I'm not convinced by some of those methods, to be honest. But I think the idea of making things more accessible in terms of, are these things understandable? Are the examples that you're using accessible? Is the way that you're teaching conducive to understanding? I think that's a great idea, and I think making sure that that students are involved in that is a really nice idea, really nice way of making sure that what you're doing makes sense. I guess where I would potentially, I don't know if draw the line is too harsh, but where I would start to question it is about content. So are we suggesting that students should be involved in designing the content of a course or not? What's your take on that?
Yeah, so there's that stance, isn't there? And it's a stance I really agree with, is that we are the experts in that particular field. We have that particular knowledge. And so I think that in terms of what we include, as long, and again, it's quite difficult to talk to an audience that's made up of lots of different backgrounds. As long as what we're talking about isn't isolating, isn't offensive, I think that the academics should have quite a lot of free flow with the content that they're teaching. For me, it's more in terms of how we design and talk about that content, perhaps, so that it is as accessible as possible.
Cool. Yeah, I think that makes a lot of sense. The second thing that you spoke about in your article, though, was about feedback. So again, I guess it's similar to what you were just talking about in terms of accessibility, in terms of making sure that feedback is clear, not just at the end point of the module, but all the way through. Am I understanding your argument correctly?
Yeah, so one of the key things that I kind of pioneer in terms of my teaching is to make sure that feedback is standardized across modules, standardized across assignments, and is as accessible as possible. So it both gives that positivity and that reinforcement, but it also gives very clear direction in terms of how to push on and do better in the future. So just a little bit of a point on that. When I was at university, one of the most frustrating things for me was to see different assignments marked differently. Obviously, you have different rubrics which shows you how to mark that work, but the feedback was presented differently. And in some cases, and I think we've all done it at one point, but hopefully snapped out of it, is to highlight maybe a phrase or something that we don't fully understand and just comment a question mark, which in our minds might be saying to a student, I don't know what this means. But actually, what a student needs to progress is for you to say, I'm not entirely sure what you was trying to get at here. Is it this? If so, have you tried presenting it in this way? And obviously that takes a lot more work. And there's scholars such as Dr. Andy Grayson, who's done a lot of work in terms of feedback mechanisms and how to speed that up for an academic, but also give that individualization, which we'll check out and talk about in a different podcast. But for me, it's about also how you can think about providing that feedback throughout the module. So it might not just be assessment on work. It might be feedback such as, I'm not getting this particular topic. I know you've tried to talk about it a couple of times, but it's still not clicking with me. Can we talk about it in a little bit more detail? It could be feedback for you as an academic, such as, this concept that you're talking about, it's not fully accessible to me either. Is there a way in which we can talk about it in different terminology, something perhaps more updated? But what we notice is that one of the reasons why individuals might possibly be doing worse in terms of their degree and acting to increase this awarding gap is that they might not feel that they're able to seek this help. They might not feel that they can provide this feedback. And so one thing that I actively do is keep what's called a Padlet. So it's a piece of online software which allows you to anonymously post on a discussion board, and then people can either comment on it or you can lock those posts. And what that allows me to do is, as I'm teaching, but also preparing for a session, is to have a look at that feedback. And if a student perhaps has a question about the content as I'm talking, but they don't feel they can put their hand up. And this also maps onto perhaps students that have higher levels of anxiety or don't want to feel embarrassed in front of their peers. Students who are at their first year of university, perhaps. I can see that a question has come through and I can either answer it directly, so I can stop the session and address it. Or one thing that I really like to do, and I've had really positive feedback from students in the past who have kind of self-disclosed afterwards, is I've been able to keep the lecture going and then almost seamlessly start to talk about that comment or question in my delivery. And what that kind of does is it gives that safeguard for that student who, if in case someone is just something as simple as other students might see them on their phone texting in a question or asking on the online discussion group, and then if I stop the session straight away, it almost says that student not only has a question so they don't understand, but also that student is anxious, so doesn't want to ask the question. So I've been quite commendated on the fact that I can seamlessly bring these questions or comments into my delivery and just keep the lecture going. And I think that for me is something that's really beneficial, and it really does help students know that they are feeling supported and can ask questions at any time, which hopefully helps us to close that gap.
Yeah, I think it's about getting that balance right, isn't it, between formative and summative feedback. So summative is where you have feedback after something that's assessed. So something that's going to be credit weighting or credit bearing, that's going to actively feed into a grade, whereas formative feedback is more informal. It happens during the module. So I do that a lot, actually, in terms of thinking through how do I test my students without it looking like a test, if that makes sense.
Yeah,
so
sure.
Things like class discussions, class debates, getting them to do mini presentations to the rest of the group, getting them to ask questions of each other, because usually if there's a question that someone has, it's often easier to ask someone else what they think than it is to ask the person at the front of the class. So yeah, I think these kinds of things are things that you can build in. And like you say, we're not just talking about demographic groups here. We're not just talking about race or gender or social class, but people who might have other needs in the classroom.
Yeah.
People who maybe can't follow material, people who don't have the confidence to put their hand up or to speak out in a classroom. We've all been there. I was that person when I was an undergraduate. So yeah, I think that's a really nice way of doing that. And what you're doing whilst you're doing that is breaking down some of the barriers that people have to accessing support. And I know that's another thing that you kind of mentioned in your article about the importance of breaking down barriers to to access
Yeah.
in higher education, and what that can do in terms of bridging those attainment gaps.
Yeah, so I think one of the and I'll leave a hyperlink to an article in the kind of crib notes and in the description for the YouTube viewers, is that what we noticed during COVID was that this awarding gap, for whatever reason, and we've got some hypotheses that we'll talk about in a second, this awarding gap actually shrunk across the UK, which was quite considerable, quite statistically significant. And perhaps one of the reasons for that is because lots of individuals were learning remotely. And because of that remote learning, what it meant was that lots of students now suddenly find themselves on a level playing field. Students that probably have that class confidence so that they can kind of maybe I don't want to use, I'm going to use the word, but I don't mean it in a negative way, monopolize an academic's time. They can ask lots of questions. They can direct conversations that are to their interests. Suddenly that was eradicated. You had lots of different ways of teaching, rightly or wrongly, lots of discussion boards online where students were posting daily or weekly comments to which an academic would type questions back. You had more kind of intuitive things like some of the work that you and I were doing in terms of recording visual or auditory feedback so that students felt more entwined within that community. But what we see holistically across the UK is this awarding gap decreased. Some institutions got rid of their exams in place of essays, which again might reduce some of those barriers that people might feel anxious about. They might not work as well in those exam settings, and therefore everyone's doing an essay. Everyone might have more time, and time is actually a really important one. We saw across the UK lots of extenuating circumstances. So some universities called them EECs, some call them kind of prolonged extensions, and because lots of students had more time to complete their essays, that meant that those essays were being conducted to a much stronger degree. And whether or not you agree that students should be given more time to complete assignments than what they currently have, actually, when you're trying to assess knowledge, and going back to what we was talking about in our last podcast about transferable skills, actually, for me as a potential employer, I would much rather know that a student has that capability, has that knowledge, and has those skills, and that they can do that in 10 weeks versus they have similar levels, but they can do it in 8 weeks and they don't actually have to try as much as they did. So what we did see is that these breaking down of barriers, really efficient, really practical. And actually, I think that institutions that have foregone all of this kind of online technology that they learned during COVID, even such as having some meetings or some personal tuition sessions that are online, actually they might lose some of that benefit if they go back to a full on-campus model. So for example, students who perhaps come from lower socioeconomic backgrounds, actually for them to come into university and maybe have to take a day off of a part-time job just to come into a tuition session, which could be held online at a different time, actually, that's a big deal for them. It's a day or half a day's income, and they might have to pay for a train or a bus, which, you know, all of these costs creep in together. So potentially, in quotes, little things like that can have huge impacts on their degrees.
Yeah, 100%. I think some of those adjustments, I guess, that were made during COVID, I think over time we're seeing them be kind of drawn back and walk back. And I'm not convinced that that's the right decision, to be honest, in terms of mandated on-campus classes and things like that. I can see the value in having on-campus classes, and I think that there are certain types of session where that works really well. So seminars, for example, if you're trying to get people to be interactive, it's very difficult to do that online. I personally don't see that much value in big lectures being in person with half full lecture halls, where it's a member of staff just talking for an hour or for an hour or two. I don't see there being much value in that, to be honest, particularly when you think about how attainment can be impacted by lower levels of engagement. I think the point that you raised at the end there about if someone's coming in for 1 hour of a day and they're having to take time off work to do that, we know that the cost of living at the moment is absolutely skyrocketing. You think about the cost of fuel to get in, if you think about the cost of public transport, think about the fact that actually there's lots of strikes in the UK at the moment in terms of public transport. We've seen it on in different places that we teach, and that students just can't get in at the moment a lot of the time because there are so many strikes related to the cost of living. So yeah, I think that these things are slowly being taken away, not necessarily for the better. Like you say, some of the changes that were made in terms of making exams open book or turning exams into coursework makes perfect sense to me. I've been quite outspoken in the past about the fact that I don't see there being much value in exams at all. I can't remember the last time I did any task in exam conditions as anything other than a student. So yeah, I don't see that being particularly problematic to keep some of those assessments that way. I know there were some things that you mentioned about kind of extensions, and various different universities introduced safety net policies where students wouldn't get anything less than their second year mark. And I struggle to get on board with some of that, if I'm being completely honest, because I think that there are issues around if you tell someone that you're guaranteed this grade, it doesn't matter what you do, then there's something to do with motivation then that might wane in the third year. So I queried that a little bit. I wonder whether or not there were other ways that maybe you could do that. But I think otherwise, all of these adaptations, all of these adjustments make perfect sense. And like you said, they seem to lead to this reduction in attainment gaps.
Yeah, there's just kind of just a couple of points just to kind of finish us off. The first one, jumping on what you were saying about having maybe workshops and seminars in person, having pre-recorded or at least online lectures. One of the benefits of having those as pre-recorded or definitely recorded at the time, the pure benefit is, again, when you're looking at perhaps kind of your atypical student groups, you might have parents, okay, or you might have people who are working in institutions or have full-time jobs, and one of the benefits there is that these individuals can actually access that material at a time which is suitable for them, and that's why I'm a huge proponent of online courses. I think that done right, students get a palatable way of learning and definitely a degree which is on the same margins. However, obviously, if you do it wrong, you can lead to students who feel isolated. One of the negatives of online learning in terms of the COVID era is that what I have seen reported is that some students who then came back to campus, when they were doing either group presentations or individual presentations, especially if they didn't have that level of socialization during their college years, actually were losing marks because they perhaps didn't have that level of confidence or they didn't have that level of experience. And going back to what you were saying about the difference between summative assessments and formative assessments, actually, then the onus comes back on the academic to say, okay, so actually leading up to these big group assignments or these individual presentations, how can I make space in my classroom for students to stand up in their seats and deliver some content? Or how can I entice students to the front to start to deliver some of that content? And I think if we entwine those little learning exercises within our classroom activities, then that's something which will give students confidence and actually allows them to do their final assessments to a much stronger degree. So I hope you found that entirely useful today. If you have and you're watching on YouTube, make sure to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and let us know in the comments down below what you thought of the adjustments that were made during COVID. Have you noticed an attainment gap in your teaching or as a student yourself? Thank you once again from Craig and I, and we will catch you in the next video.